So, playing cards. Playing cards are not only our tools, but they're also things that we want to keep around and sort of collect and sort of maybe display around as well. And as a result of that, we sort of want them to stay intact for as long as possible. And I say for as long as possible because we can't really keep them around forever. At the end of the day, they're just pieces of paper. And we all know how long pieces of paper last in general. Like, they don't really last all that long. Like, they're flimsy, like whatever, right? So we can't really keep them around forever, but there are ways to keep them around for longer. So here are just a couple of tips that I found to be useful, especially when I'm trying to make my cards last longer. Because again, as a cardist, as a magician, as a collector, I want these things to stay around for as long as possible. So the first tip is, and this might seem like common sense, it's just store your cards properly. And again, it sounds like common sense, but I know some people who actually just toss decks in their pockets, or even just like they wrap a rubber band around of their cards, which doesn't sound bad on the surface, but sometimes the rubber band is too tight and actually causes the edges of the cards to actually fray a bit. There's actually a tuck case for a reason for cards, or you can actually get a carrot case for your cards. Whatever the reason is, you want them to be stored properly, because then it prevents any splits or any bends from happening to your cards. And so yeah, and besides, like, the tuck case is there for a reason, right? They don't, like, it's there to store their cards properly, and it's there to protect your cards. Because at the end of the day, this is just a cardboard box. You really don't really use it for anything besides like a couple of magic effects. But generally, the cards are where that you want to, like, it's like the main purpose of what you're doing, right? So you want to keep your cards alive. The box, unless you're a collector, maybe you want to store these properly, but for the most part, it's your cards that are the main focus. So the next tip that I have for you is to practice over a softer surface. You, as a magician or as a cardist, you are going to drop cards a lot. And I mean a lot. And 90% of the time when you drop a card, it's going to land on the corner. And when that happens, especially if it lands on a hard surface, the corner is going to split. And then you can't really pharaoh shuffle the cards anymore. Which I guess is sort of niche, but also it damages your cards, and over time that split will only worsen, right? So it's not really something that you want. And in certain cases, especially if you drop them on like a desk or whatever, it might actually cause like a tiny rip in the cards as well. So by practicing over a carpet or like over like your bed or anything like that, whenever you drop the cards, it will, like, there just won't be any damage because of that softer surface, as opposed to dropping your cards on like a harder surface. So, well, for my room, everything is like carpeted, so it's carpeted. I don't know why I can't English, but everything is carpeted, so the floor is like carpet, so everything is fine. But if you don't have that, then you can practice over your bed or anything like that, or even you can even practice like in front of a close-up pad. That will let you protect your cards if you drop your cards in any case. So cards are paper, and as we all know, paper is rather susceptible to things like moisture, to the weather, and all of those different things. So for example, when the weather gets too humid, the fibers of the cards will actually bloat, causing the cards to bend, to warp, which will cause the cards to actually stick together because of all the moisture. On the other hand, if the weather is too dry, then the cards will actually, the fibers of the cards will actually tighten, causing the cards to warp too. So when the weather is either too warm or too dry, too humid or too dry, the result is the same. The cards are going to bend and they're going to warp. So if you have weather that's too humid, you might want to get something like a dehumidifier. Like, I know my family has one, especially for like the showers and all that stuff. But if your room is too humid, then you might want to get a dehumidifier. On the other hand, if your room is too dry and you can feel your hands not like it's a very specific like weirdness, because I know in the winter my hands get extremely dry. So in that case, you might want to look for a humidifier, in which case it'll help the cards actually warp less. Okay, so it really depends on the weather that you have over in your country or in your home. Again, it really depends. So obviously this option might not be available to everyone, because a humidifier or dehumidifier might be a bit more expensive, so it's not really ideal. And honestly, for me personally, I don't really care about deck clicks. But if you do, then you might want to spend a couple more bucks getting a humidifier or a dehumidifier. Also, I just want to address a common urban myth, and that is using card clips. Because I know people say like, oh, you can use card clips to keep cards from being like warped. Maybe if they're still in the box, right? Maybe if they're still in the box and they're still being clipped. But honestly, the moment that you take cards out of the box away from the card clip, the weather's gonna affect them regardless, right? Because again, it's you're asking this thing to protect you, to protect paper against the weather. It's just not happening, right? So really the best solution against card warping, especially in your current like establishment, is probably just a humidifier or a dehumidifier. The next tip that I have for you is to just practice with clean hands and just in a clean environment. So just generally like just having everything clean, because you don't want to touch cards after eating things like fried chicken, because then your hands are all going to be greasy and then your cards are going to be all greasy and it's just going to be gross. Or maybe even after like eating dessert where things are like the table's like sticky or your hands are sticky, you really don't want to touch cards after that, because again, this is paper. It'll absorb everything that you give it, whether it's grease or like sugar. Like I know sometimes like I accidentally touch cards after like eating something that's like relatively sticky. I'm like, oh, now the cards don't fan properly and now they're sticking to each other. Like that sucks. So generally you want to have clean hands and a clean surface to practice on. Honestly, when I actually practice over like any sort of table, I actually place down the tuck case first on the table, and I would take my deck and I would place it on top of the tuck case just to make sure that there's actually a layer of protection in between of the potentially nasty table and of my cards. So that's just something that you can do to ensure that your cards remain as clean as possible. Even though ideally you shouldn't bring cards when you're eating, because still there's sauces and might drop down on your cards or whatever, okay? So that's just something that can happen. But if you're just chilling at a coffee shop and you don't want to place your cards on like maybe a potential coffee stain, again, tuck case, box, and everything will work out. So another tip that I have for you is just letting your decks rest. So after using a deck for an entire day, you might notice that they might become slightly blockier than before. They don't fan as well as before. They become warped, and it's just overall not a very pleasant usage experience, I guess, practice experience. In that case, you might want to switch out your deck. You might want to turn to your deck collection, pull another deck, and then use that deck. In the meantime, that will allow the deck that you were using beforehand to just rest up, to just let the fibers of the cards just settle down again. And then, you know, when you return back to that deck, you'll notice that, oh, I can actually fan this deck again. It feels slightly more like better rather than being all gross. Now, obviously, even though like you're letting the decks rest and you're rotating to a different deck, those cards will never feel the exact same as when it was like right out of the box, okay? It's just not happening. It's paper. They're going to be damaged over time. It's going to accumulate damage over time, but just letting them rest and rotating them out is just a good way to just let your cards just last longer, because, you know, you're giving them time to rest and you're using other decks in the meantime, okay? So just letting your decks rest is just a good habit to have overall, and you don't have to get tired of seeing the same design over and over and over again. Another thing, and this depends on really depends on the person, but you should not do moves that bend the cards. So things like back palms, springs, pressure fans, all of those moves actually bend and loosen the fibers of the cards. So you want to keep your cards in top shape for as long as possible, and you want them to retain that snap for the cards. Well, maybe you shouldn't do as many pressure moves as possible. Maybe you should avoid bending your cards in weird ways. I actually mentioned this in the Guide to Breaking In Cards video, but I actually rarely break in decks anymore. Like, I know for cardist and all that stuff, when you actually use like a broken in deck, it's actually better for packet cuts, and for magicians in general, it's just like a good way to keep cards from like sliding around and all that stuff. But I just don't really see the use in that anymore. I just practice the hell out of with with like a single deck, and then eventually through just general use, the cards will break in, right, eventually. But because of the fact I'm not using any pressure moves, they still retain that snap. Okay, so again, it really depends on what you want to do with your cards, but generally I don't really see the use of breaking in cards anymore, so I don't bend cards all that much anymore, unless I want to do like things like under pressure and all that stuff for like audience members or friends like that, right? So generally, not bending your cards is a good way to keep your cards intact for a longer period of time. And now here's a final tip, and this is not going to like make your cards last longer. It'll just make your cards more usable for certain cases, I would say. So if your cards no longer fan or they no longer spread, fanning powder or wax are products that you can apply to your cards so then they can fan and spread once more. So if you're someone who appreciates like a deck that can fan or a deck that can spread, you can use those two products. There are already a lot of videos on how to apply fanning powder, but if you want a video where I go over how to apply fanning powder and how to apply like wax, just tell me, I'll gladly make one. Now do note that fanning powder and wax will change the way that the cards actually feel. Again, it'll give them like a waxy feel. But if you do just want your cards to fan and spread again, then fanning powder is a good way to make the cards actually go back to that state, even though it changes that sort of changes the feeling of the cards. On the other hand, if you're like someone like a card manipulator who wants like cards to like fan and all that stuff, despite all the bends and all that stuff, fanning powder again is something that you can use. Even though I'm not someone that does like card manipulation stuff. But again, fanning powder is an alternative if your deck is completely pooped and you only have like a poop deck. So yeah, and that was just a quick guide on how to make your cards last as long as possible. It's kind of funny because I actually don't follow some of my own advice. I just sort of like let the cards do what, like I sort of just do whatever I want, which is sort of bad because it's not very economical, but it's whatever. I have so many cards at this point that I'm like, yeah, it's fine, I'll just rotate them out, it's fine, I don't really care anymore. Which speaks, I guess that's really privileged of me to say. But it's things that I bought over time, so it's alright. But yeah, if you are someone who's more concerned about budget and all those things, I do hope that this video does help you, because I know for a lot more experienced like magicians and cardists, we have so many cards that we just don't really care anymore. But for people who are younger and who are new to this hobby, it's sort of hard for them to justify spending like $15 or even like $20 on new decks these days, which is ridiculous because companies are just scamming people now. But if you're just using bikes and all that stuff and you have like a massive bunch of them, then yeah, feel free to rotate them around. Again, use these tips to like store them properly, right? Have clean environments to practice on. All of those tips will help your cards last longer. And again, it's just more economical and all of that stuff. Whereas I'm desensitized to all that stuff, which is not good. But yeah, I hope this video actually helped you out, or at least gave you an idea on how to handle your cards with care. And yeah, that's about it, I guess. Yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, and see you guys next time.